The air felt different at Westridge High School that Monday morning. The hallways buzzed with the usual back-to-school energy, but for one 15-year-old boy, the day carried extra weight. Alex Chen clutched his schedule tightly as he navigated the unfamiliar corridors, his heart beating a little faster with each step. Route 203, Advanced Literature with Miss Peterson, he whispered to himself, double-checking the paper in his hand. Just 3 weeks ago, Alex and his mom had packed up their small apartment across the country. His mother, a healthcare worker, had received a job offer she couldn't refuse, better pay, better hours, and a chance for both of them to start fresh. But starting fresh meant leaving behind friends who understood him, teachers who believed in him, and the comfort of belonging. As Alex approached the classroom door, he took a deep breath. He'd always found refuge in books and writing. His previous teachers had even sent his poems to young writers' competitions. Literature class had always been his safe space. "You must be new," said a friendly voice. A tall boy with glasses smiled at him. "I'm David. First day?" Alex nodded with relief at the warm welcome. "Yeah, just moved here." "I'm Alex." "Ms. Peterson's class is pretty tough, but you'll be fine," David said, holding the door open. "Come on, bell's about to ring." The classroom was bright and lined with bookshelves. 20-something students were settling into their seats, the morning chatter filling the room. At the front, a middle-aged woman with short graying hair and thin-framed glasses organized papers on her desk. She looked up briefly as Alex and David entered. "Good morning, David," she said with a warm smile, then her eyes shifted to Alex. The smile faded slightly. "You must be the transfer student." "Yes, ma'am." "Alex Chen." He handed her his registration slip. Miss Peterson glanced at it, her expression cooling. "We're already 3 weeks into the semester. I hope you can catch up." She looked around the room. "Take that empty desk in the back corner." Alex made his way past rows of curious eyes. The back corner felt miles away from the teacher's desk, tucked behind a tall student whose broad shoulders would make it hard to see the board. As class began, Miss Peterson welcomed everyone back with enthusiasm, discussing their current study of American poetry. Her passion for literature was clear as she moved around the front of the classroom, making eye contact with students in the first few rows. Alex listened intently, feeling a spark of hope when she mentioned their upcoming poetry project. "We'll be exploring personal narrative this week," she announced. "Who can tell me about the elements that make personal stories powerful in poetry?" Several hands shot up, including Alex's. Miss Peterson called on 3 students before looking toward the back of the room. Alex's hand remained raised. "Jenny, what do you think?" she asked, calling on a girl sitting near Alex who hadn't raised her hand. Jenny stumbled through an answer while Alex slowly lowered his arm. He tried again during the discussion about metaphor, and again when they talked about influential poets. Each time, Miss Peterson's gaze seemed to slide past him as if his corner of the room was invisible. When the bell rang, Alex gathered his books slowly. Miss Peterson was handing out assignment sheets at the door. "Miss Peterson." Alex approached her desk. "At my old school, we were studying Langston Hughes. I wrote a paper on his use of rhythm and blues influences. Would you like to see it? Maybe it would help you know where I'm at with the material." She barely looked up from her papers. "That won't be necessary. Just focus on our current assignments. We do things differently here." As Alex left the classroom, the excitement he'd felt that morning had dimmed considerably. Something about the way she looked through him rather than at him left a cold feeling in his stomach. Still, he reminded himself it was just the first day. Things would get better. They had to. He didn't notice David watching the interaction from the hallway, a concerned frown on his face. 2 weeks had passed since Alex's first day at Westridge High. The crisp fall air had turned colder, and colorful leaves crunched under his feet as he walked to school each morning. He'd settled into a routine, wake up early, help his mom with breakfast, then catch the 7:15 bus that dropped him off with just enough time to review his homework before first period. Miss Peterson's advanced literature class remained the hardest part of his day. Not because of the material. Alex loved reading and writing more than anything, but because of the growing knot in his stomach every time he crossed that classroom threshold. "All right, class, I've finished grading your analysis papers," Miss Peterson announced, waving a stack of papers. Overall, I'm quite impressed with the thought put into understanding Frost's metaphors. Alex sat up straighter. He'd spent hours on that paper, researching Frost's life and carefully crafting his analysis of The Road Not Taken. Back home, his writing had won him school awards. This was his chance to show Ms. Peterson what he could do. She moved through the rows, placing papers face down on desks with occasional comments. Lovely insights, Lily. Excellent structure, Thomas. Your best work yet, David. When she reached Alex's desk, she dropped his paper without comment and continued on. He turned it over to see a large red C circled at the top, alongside a note, superficial analysis, lacks depth and scholarly approach. His heart sank as he flipped through the pages. Red marks covered his carefully chosen quotes and thoughtful conclusions. Next to him, Thomas leaned over. What did you get? Thomas whispered. C-, Alex replied quietly. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. Seriously? Let me see that. He glanced at Alex's paper, then passed his own A-graded work over. Here, look at mine. Alex compared the two. They'd used some of the same quotes and made similar points about Frost's use of the path as a life choice metaphor. Yet Thomas's identical observations were marked insightful, while Alex's were labeled obvious. That's weird, Thomas muttered, taking his paper back. You actually went deeper than I did on the historical context. After class, Alex approached Ms. Peterson's desk clutching his paper. He'd rehearsed what to say all through the lesson. Ms. Peterson, I was hoping you could help me understand where I went wrong. He kept his voice steady. I'd like to do better next time. She looked up with a sigh that made him feel like an inconvenience. Your paper lacked the academic rigor expected in an advanced class. Perhaps regular English would be more appropriate for your skill level. But I have a faculty meeting to attend, she cut him off, gathering her belongings. If you want to improve, I suggest more careful reading of the assigned materials. As she walked away, Alex noticed David lingering by the door. He'd obviously overheard everything. Don't take it personally, David said as they walked together to the cafeteria. She's always been tough. Is she, though? Alex asked. On everyone. David hesitated. Well, look at this. Alex showed him a paragraph that had been heavily marked down. David pulled out his own paper where an almost identical passage had received praise. By lunchtime, word had spread. Lily and Thomas joined them at their table, bringing their papers for comparison. This isn't right, Lily said, looking troubled as she compared the grading disparities. Your conclusion was better than mine, but I got an A and you got a C-. Maybe she just doesn't like me, Alex said, trying to sound casual though the hurt ran deep. Or maybe it's something else, Thomas said quietly, exchanging glances with the others. Alex had noticed the pattern. When he raised his hand, Ms. Peterson called on others. When Asian American Lily or Hispanic Carlos participated, she was polite but brief. When others spoke, she engaged enthusiastically. The classroom had invisible lines Alex couldn't see but definitely felt. The following week brought their poetry interpretation assignment. Alex poured his heart into analyzing Langston Hughes' I too, connecting it thoughtfully to American history and his own experiences. When he received another poor grade while watching substantially similar work from certain classmates earn praise, the truth became impossible to ignore. The issue wasn't his writing, it was who was doing the writing. We need to document this, Lily whispered after class, her face determined. My sister's in pre-law. She says if we're going to prove something's unfair, we need evidence. Alex nodded slowly. He tried to ignore it, to work harder, to earn approval. But sometimes working within a broken system wasn't enough. I just wanted to learn and share my ideas like everyone else, he said softly. You deserve that chance, David replied, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. And we're going to make sure you get it. For the first time since arriving at Westridge High, Alex felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. The poetry project was the assignment Alex had been waiting for. Ms. Peterson announced it on a Monday in late October when the classroom windows were decorated with paper leaves in red and gold. This will count for 20% of your semester grade, she explained, passing out the rubric sheets. You'll each write an original poem and then present it to the class next Friday. Your topic should reflect something personally meaningful, a moment that shaped you. Alex felt a rush of excitement. Poetry had always been his safe place, the way he made sense of his world. Back home, his grandfather had taught him that words could build bridges between experiences, helping others understand what it meant to walk in different shoes. That evening, Alex called his grandfather. The familiar voice brought comfort across the miles between them. "How's school going, son?" Grandpa Lead asked. Alex hesitated. He hadn't told his family about Ms. Peterson's treatment. His mom was working double shifts to get established at her new job, and he didn't want to add to her worries. "We have a poetry project," he said instead. "I'm thinking about writing about your stories." His grandfather had lived through decades of change in America. As a young man in the 1960s, he'd marched for equal rights and later became one of the first Asian American business owners in their hometown. He'd faced slammed doors and cruel words, but also witnessed remarkable progress. "Tell the truth, Alex," his grandfather said gently, "even when it's hard for others to hear, especially then." For the next week, Alex worked on his poem every evening. He crafted each line carefully, connecting his grandfather's experiences to his own, exploring what it meant to belong in places that sometimes signaled you didn't. He practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his pacing and tone, determined to make his grandfather proud. Friday arrived with a nervous energy in the classroom. Students shuffled papers and whispered last-minute practice lines to themselves. Miss Peterson called them up alphabetically by last name. "Chen, you're after Brewer," she announced, not looking at Alex. Thomas Brewer shared a poem about a camping trip where he'd gotten lost and found his way back using the stars. The class applauded warmly, and Miss Peterson praised his use of metaphor. "Next, Alex Chen," she said, her voice noticeably cooler. Alex walked to the front of the room, his paper trembling slightly in his hands. He took a deep breath and began. "The poem I've written is called Invisible Bridges. It's about my grandfather's life and the connections between his experiences and mine." He began to read, his voice growing stronger with each line. He described his grandfather joining protest marches in his 20s, the windows broken at his first small shop, and the neighbor who stood guard outside all night afterward. He spoke of family dinners where stories were shared across generations, of lessons learned about resilience and hope. As Alex reached the middle of his poem, connecting his grandfather's past to his own present experiences at a new school, Ms. Peterson's chair scraped loudly as she stood up. "That's enough, Alex," she interrupted, her voice sharp. Alex stopped mid-sentence, confused. "I'm sorry." This assignment was for a personal reflection poem, not a political statement. "But this is personal," Alex said, his heart racing. "These are my grandfather's experiences and how they—" I said that's enough. Miss Peterson's voice cut through the room like ice. "This content is inappropriate for our classroom discussion. Please take your seat." The silence that followed was deafening. 24 pairs of eyes darted between Alex and Miss Peterson. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "But I'm not finished," Alex said quietly, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I've still got half the poem." "Your poem is making other students uncomfortable with its political agenda," Ms. Peterson said firmly. "Take your seat now, or you'll receive a 0 for the assignment." Alex looked around the room. Far from looking uncomfortable, his classmates appeared shocked at the interruption. David gave him a supple nod of support. Lily's face had gone red with anger. Thomas was frantically writing something in his notebook, taking notes on what was happening, Alex realized. With shaking hands, Alex gathered his paper and walked back to his desk. The room remained silent as Ms. Peterson called the next student. The remaining presentations felt hollow, with classmates delivering their poems in subdued voices while shooting concerned glances at Alex. When the bell rang, nobody rushed out as usual. Students lingered, forming a protective circle around Alex. "That was completely unfair," Lily said loudly enough for Ms. Peterson to hear. "Your poem was beautiful," Carlos added. "My grandparents have similar stories." David handed Alex a folded note. "Meet us at the library after school. All of us, this has gone too far." That evening, Alex sat on his bed with his phone, tears rolling down his cheeks as he called his grandfather again. "I couldn't finish it, Grandpa. She stopped me halfway, said it was too political." His grandfather was quiet for a moment. Did you tell your truth, Alex? I tried to. That I'm proud of you. Some people fear truths that challenge their view of the world, but that doesn't make those truths any less important to tell. Alex wiped his eyes. What do I do now? What do you think you should do? Alex thought about his new friends waiting for him in the library, about the notes Thomas had been taking, about the anger in Lily's eyes. I think I need to make sure my voice is heard, he said finally, not just for me. That's my boy, his grandfather said softly. Remember what I always tell you. Change doesn't come from staying silent, Alex finished, a new determination rising within him. The school library hummed with quiet determination that afternoon. Alex found his classmates gathered at a back table, surrounded by notebooks and snacks. 6 of them had shown up: David, Lily, Thomas, Carlos, and 2 others, Zoe and Miguel, who Alex knew from class but hadn't spoken with much. We've had enough, David said once they were all settled. What happened today wasn't okay. It's never been okay, Lily added, her voice tight with anger. But stopping your poem was crossing a line. Thomas slid his notebook toward the center of the table. I've been keeping track for the past 3 weeks. Look at this. The pages were filled with dates, assignments, and detailed notes comparing how Ms. Peterson treated different students. He'd recorded instances of ignored raised hands, interruptions, and most stunning of all, the grade differences for nearly identical work. You did all this? Alex asked, surprised. Thomas shrugged. My mom's a lawyer. She always says if something feels wrong, document everything. My brother had Ms. Peterson 2 years ago, Zoe said quietly. He had similar problems, but nobody believed him. He just stopped trying in that class. Alex felt a mixture of emotions, gratitude that he wasn't alone, but sadness that this had been happening for so long. What can we do, though? Carlos asked. It's our word against hers. She's been teaching here forever. That's why we need more evidence, David said. And more people. The group spent the next hour creating a plan that would continue documenting every instance of unfair treatment. Lily, who worked on the school newspaper, would quietly reach out to former students for their experiences. Miguel suggested recording classes, but the others worried about school rules against recording without permission. We should talk to our parents, Thomas said as they wrapped up. We need adult support. Alex's stomach tightened. My mom's working so hard right now with her new job. I don't want to add more stress. Then let's start with my parents, Thomas offered. My mom will know what to do. That evening, Alex finally told his mother everything. They sat at their small kitchen table, the remains of dinner pushed aside as he showed her the graded papers and explained about the poetry presentation. Lin Chen listened silently, her tired eyes growing increasingly troubled. When Alex finished, she reached across the table and took his hands. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked softly. You've been working so hard. I didn't want to worry you. She squeezed his hands. Nothing is more important to me than you being treated fairly. Nothing. The next morning, Lin Chen called the school to request a meeting with Ms. Peterson. The secretary scheduled it for Thursday afternoon, the only time Ms. Peterson claimed to be available that week. Thursday's not good, Lin explained. I have hospital shifts I can't change. Could we try early morning instead? The secretary paused. Ms. Peterson doesn't do morning meetings. Thursday at 4:30 is what she offered. Lin had to switch shifts with a coworker, losing premium pay hours to make it work. When Thursday arrived, she left work early and rushed to the school, still wearing her hospital scrubs. Alex waited anxiously outside the classroom, his stomach in knots. When his mother arrived, slightly out of breath, he hugged her tightly. Thank you for coming, he whispered. Always, she replied. They knocked on Miss Peterson's door at exactly 4:30. No answer. They waited 5 minutes and knocked again. At 4:45, the school secretary passed by. Oh, you're still here? Ms. Peterson left about 20 minutes ago. She said something came up. Lin Chen's expression hardened. Did she leave a message for us? We had a scheduled meeting. The secretary looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, she didn't mention anything. On the drive home, Lin was unusually quiet. Alex watched her knuckles turn white on the steering wheel. Mom? Are you mad at me? She immediately softened. No, honey. Never. I'm angry at the situation. She took a deep breath. But I want you to know something important. When people treat you unfairly, it says everything about them and nothing about you or your worth." The next day, Alex met his friends in the library again. More students had joined them, including several from other class periods who had heard what happened. "My mom tried to meet with Ms. Peterson yesterday, but she left before our appointment," Alex explained. "She didn't even leave a message." "Same thing happened to my parents last year," Miguel said. "They got rescheduled 3 times before giving up." "My mom's not giving up," Alex said firmly. "She's calling the principal directly today." As they continued planning, the library door opened and Mr. Rivera, the school counselor, walked in. He noticed their group and approached slowly. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. The students exchanged nervous glances. "We're just studying," Lily said quickly. Mr. Rivera smiled gently. "I think we both know that's not all you're doing, and I think it's about time someone listened to what you have to say." He pulled up a chair, sat down, and did something adults rarely did with teenagers. He simply waited, giving them space to decide whether to trust him. Finally, David spoke. "It's about Ms. Peterson." Mr. Rivera nodded. "I thought it might be. I've noticed things over the years, but without students willing to speak up." He trailed off, then looked directly at Alex. "Sometimes it takes one person's courage to open the door for change." For the first time since the poetry presentation, Alex felt a surge of hope. Maybe being heard was possible after all. "We have evidence," Thomas said, reaching for his notebook. "Lots of it." Mr. Rivera looked at each of them in turn. "Then I think it's time we put it to use. The question is, are you all ready for what comes next? Because speaking truth to power is never easy." "We're ready," Alex said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. Lin Chen's voice echoed in his mind. Nothing is more important than being treated fairly. Nothing. The following week passed in a blur of preparation. With Mr. Rivera's guidance, Alex and his friends gathered their evidence into a comprehensive file. Thomas organized the grade comparisons, showing identical answers that received different marks. Lily compiled testimonials from current and former students who had experienced similar treatment. Carlos and Miguel created a timeline of incidents from the current semester. Mr. Rivera helped them schedule a meeting with Principal Thompson, insisting it happen during school hours so all the student witnesses could attend. Lin Chen requested time off work, determined not to miss this important moment. The day of the meeting arrived with a mixture of nervousness and determination. Alex hardly slept the night before, going over what he wanted to say again and again in his head. His grandfather had called that morning with simple advice: "Speak your truth clearly and let the facts speak for themselves." Principal Thompson's office felt smaller than Alex had imagined. Bookshelves lined one wall, and framed diplomas hung behind a large wooden desk. When they arrived, the principal seemed surprised by their numbers. Alex and his mother, Mr. Rivera, and 5 classmates with their evidence folders. "I wasn't expecting quite such a delegation," Principal Thompson said, adjusting his tie. He was a tall man with graying hair who had been running Westridge High for over a decade. "My secretary mentioned a concern about Ms. Peterson's class, but this looks rather formal." "It is formal, Mr. Thompson," Lin Chen replied. "My son and these students have experienced ongoing discriminatory treatment that needs to be addressed." The principal's expression tightened. "That's a very serious accusation, Ms. Chen." "Which is why we've brought serious evidence," Thomas added, placing his folder on the desk. For the next 40 minutes, the students presented their case. They took turns speaking, each describing specific incidents they had witnessed or experienced. Principal Thompson listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing as he reviewed the grade comparisons and testimonials. "And then she stopped me from finishing my poem," Alex explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "She claimed it was too political when I was simply sharing my family's experiences." "Ms. Peterson has been teaching at this school for 23 years, Principal Thompson said finally, closing the folder. "She's been department head for 15. She has an exemplary record." The room fell silent. Alex felt his hope begin to slip away. "With all due respect, sir," Mr. Rivera said quietly, "an exemplary record doesn't mean mistakes haven't been made. The evidence these students have gathered deserves serious consideration." The principal sighed, rubbing his forehead. I'll need to review all this more thoroughly. And of course, I'll need to speak with Ms. Peterson to hear her perspective. Of course, Lin Chen agreed, but we would appreciate some assurance that these concerns will be taken seriously and addressed promptly. Principal Thompson seemed about to respond when a knock at the door interrupted them. The office door opened, and Ms. Peterson herself walked in. "Sorry to interrupt, but your secretary mentioned you were in a meeting about my class." Her confident smile faltered slightly when she saw who was present. "I thought I should join." The tension in the room immediately thickened. Alex felt his mouth go dry as Ms. Peterson's eyes briefly met his before turning away. "We were just discussing some concerns that have been raised," Principal Thompson explained, gesturing to the evidence folders. "What kind of concerns?" Ms. Peterson asked, her voice taking on an edge. "Concerns about unequal treatment of students," the principal replied carefully. Ms. Peterson's face flushed. "That's absurd. I treat all my students exactly the same. I have high standards for everyone." Alex couldn't help himself. "Then why did Thomas get an A on his paper when I got a C- for making the same points?" "Alex," his mother whispered in caution. "No, I want to know," Alex continued, sliding the 2 papers across the desk toward Ms. Peterson. "Why did you praise his metaphor analysis but call mine superficial? Why do you call on some students but ignore others? Why did you stop my poem when others could share personal stories?" Ms. Peterson's expression hardened. "I don't have to justify my professional judgments to students. If you're struggling in my class, perhaps you should focus more on improving your work rather than making accusations." "These aren't just accusations," David spoke up, pointing to the evidence folders. "We have proof, lots of it." Principal Thompson cleared his throat. "I think we should continue this discussion after I've had time to review everything more thoroughly." He turned to Ms. Peterson. "We'll need to meet privately to discuss these concerns." Ms. Peterson's confidence seemed to waver as she glanced at the thick folders. "This is ridiculous. These are teenagers looking for someone to blame for their academic shortcomings." "My son had straight A's in English before your class," Lin Chen said quietly but firmly. "His previous teachers recognized his talent. The only thing that changed was who was reading his work." The principal stood, signaling the meeting was ending. "I'll review everything and schedule follow-up meetings as needed. I appreciate everyone bringing these concerns forward in such an organized manner." As they filed out of the office, Ms. Peterson remained behind with the principal. Through the partially closed door, they could hear her voice rising in defense. In the hallway, the group huddled together, the tension slowly releasing from their shoulders. "Do you think anything will change?" Carlos asked. "Something has to," Lely replied. "They can't ignore all that evidence." Alex wasn't sure what to feel. They'd finally been heard, but the outcome remained uncertain. The way Ms. Peterson had dismissed their concerns so easily made him worry that nothing would change. "What happens now?" he asked Mr. Rivera. The counselor placed a reassuring hand on Alex's shoulder. "Now we wait for the process to work. But know this, you've already accomplished something important today. You stood up not just for yourself, but for every student who felt the same way but stayed silent." Lin Chen hugged her son tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, "no matter what happens next." As they walked away from the principal's office, Alex noticed something had shifted within himself. The knot of anxiety that had lived in his stomach for weeks had loosened. Whether or not Ms. Peterson changed, he had found his voice and discovered he wasn't alone. 2 weeks passed with an uncomfortable tension hanging over Ms. Peterson's classroom. She continued teaching as if nothing had happened, though Alex noticed she called on him slightly more often, mechanical acknowledgments that felt forced rather than genuine. The whispers among students suggested meetings were happening behind closed doors, but no official announcements had been made. "Do you think they're just waiting for everything to blow over?" Lily asked during lunch one day. Their usual group had grown, with more students joining their table each day as word spread about their stand against Ms. Peterson. "My mom said these things take time," Thomas replied. "The principal has to follow proper procedures." Alex pushed his food around his plate. Or maybe nothing's going to happen at all. That afternoon, as Alex packed up his books after class, Ms. Peterson called his name. "Alex, could you stay back a moment?" His friends shot him concerned looks as they filed out. David mouthed, "Wait for you outside," before closing the door. Alex approached Ms. Peterson's desk cautiously. It was the first time she had asked to speak with him directly since the meeting with the principal. "Principal Thompson has informed me that I'll be taking a leave of absence for the remainder of the semester," she said, her voice stiff and formal. "Starting next Monday, Mrs. Wilson will be taking over the class." Alex wasn't sure how to respond. "Oh. I've been instructed to complete a professional development program focused on modern teaching practices and cultural awareness." The words seemed difficult for her to say. "The school board reviewed the evidence your group presented and found it compelling." There was no apology in her tone, just resignation. Alex nodded slowly, processing what this meant. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. She looked at him directly for what felt like the first time all semester. "This wasn't personal, you know. I've always had high standards." Alex gathered his courage. "It felt personal when you stopped my poem, when you ignored my raised hand, when you graded me differently than others for the same work." Ms. Peterson's face tightened. For a moment, he thought she might argue, but instead, she just sighed heavily. "Perhaps I have some reflection to do," she said quietly. "That will be all, Alex." Outside, his friends were waiting anxiously. "What happened?" David asked immediately. "She's taking a leave of absence," Alex explained. "They're making her do some kind of training program." The news spread quickly through the school. Some students celebrated, while others, mostly those Ms. Peterson had always favored, complained about disruption to their semester. To Alex's surprise, a few teachers quietly thanked him in the hallways, suggesting Ms. Peterson's behavior had been a long-standing issue that no one had previously challenged successfully. Mrs. Wilson, their substitute teacher, brought a refreshing energy to the class. She rearranged the seating chart into a circle and encouraged open discussions where everyone's voice could be heard. Alex's poetry assignment was the first thing she addressed. "I understand there was an interrupted presentation," she said on her first day. "Alex, would you like to share your complete poem with the class now?" The opportunity to finish what had been started meant more than Alex could express. When he read his poem in full, the class applauded genuinely. Several students shared how it helped them understand experiences different from their own. For 6 weeks, the class flourished under Mrs. Wilson's guidance. Then, on a Monday in early December, Ms. Peterson returned. The students fell silent as she walked in, noticing immediate differences. Her usual severe bun was replaced by a softer hairstyle, and instead of taking her place at the desk, she moved a chair to join their circle. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar hint of nervousness. "I'd like to thank Mrs. Wilson for her excellent work in my absence." Mrs. Wilson smiled warmly. "These are wonderful students. You're lucky to have them." "Yes," Ms. Peterson agreed, surprising everyone. "I believe I am." The first week of Ms. Peterson's return was strange. She taught differently, pausing more often to ask questions and making visible efforts to call on everyone equally. She used examples from diverse authors and encouraged personal connections to the literature they studied. It wasn't perfect. Old habits occasionally surfaced, but the change was unmistakable. Then came the unexpected moment that changed everything. After class on Friday, Ms. Peterson asked Alex to stay behind again. "I owe you an apology," she said directly when they were alone. The words seemed difficult for her, but she met his eyes steadily. "What I did was wrong." Alex blinked in surprise. This was the last thing he had expected. "The training program made me confront some uncomfortable truths," she continued. "I grew up in a very different world than the one we live in now. My parents and teachers had certain views that I absorbed without questioning." She took a deep breath. "That's not an excuse. It's just the beginning of understanding. Your poem about your grandfather, it showed me a perspective I've never truly considered before. I've spent my entire career teaching literature, yet I failed to grasp one of its most important purposes, to help us understand lives different from our own." Alex felt a complicated mix of emotions, vindication, lingering hurt, but also a growing respect for what it must have taken for her to say these words. "Thank you," he said simply. "I can't undo what happened," Ms. Peterson acknowledged. "But I can learn from it. And I want you to know that you've been a catalyst for important change, not just for me, but potentially for many students to come." As Alex turned to leave, she added, "Your grandfather must be very proud of you. Would you?" She hesitated. "Would you be willing to share more of his story sometime?" Walking home that afternoon, Alex felt lighter than he had in months. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would be perfect from now on. People don't change completely overnight, but something significant had shifted, creating space for growth and understanding. That evening, he called his grandfather with the news. "She apologized? Genuinely?" his grandfather asked, sounding surprised but pleased. "Yeah, and she actually asked to hear more of your stories." His grandfather was quiet for a moment. "You know, Alex, that's how real change happens. Not all at once with grand gestures, but slowly, one conversation at a time, one mind opening bit by bit." Alex smiled. "I think she's really trying." "Then that's a victory worth celebrating," his grandfather said warmly. "And you helped make it happen by speaking your truth." As they talked into the evening, Alex reflected on how far they'd all come since those first difficult days. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like Westridge High might truly become a place where he belonged. Spring came to Westridge High, bringing with it blooming trees around the campus and a sense of renewal. The winter months had seen gradual but steady change in Ms. Peterson's classroom. While not every day was perfect, the atmosphere had transformed into something more open and respectful. For the end-of-year literary showcase, a tradition at Westridge where selected students presented their best work to an audience of parents, teachers, and community members, Ms. Peterson had made an unprecedented decision. "I'd like to nominate Alex Chen as our featured presenter," she announced to the class one Friday afternoon. The room fell silent in surprise. Being the featured presenter was a significant honor, typically reserved for seniors. Alex looked up from his notebook, certain he had misheard. "Me?" Ms. Peterson nodded. "Your writing has shown exceptional growth this year. If you're willing, I think your voice deserves to be heard." Later that day, as Alex told his friends about the nomination, their reactions ranged from excitement to cautious suspicion. "Aren't you sure about this?" Lily asked. "After everything that happened?" Alex considered the question seriously. "I think she's being genuine. We've had some good conversations since she came back." "Well, if you decide to do it, we'll all be there to support you," David promised. That evening, Alex called his grandfather to share the news. "What do you think, Grandpa? Should I do it?" His grandfather chuckled softly. "That depends. Do you have something worth saying?" Alex thought about the past several months, the challenges, the friendships formed in resistance, the slow but meaningful change that had come from speaking up. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think I do." For the next 3 weeks, Alex worked on his presentation with care, revising and practicing until the words flowed naturally. He decided to expand on his original poem about his grandfather, weaving in his own recent experiences and reflections on change and understanding. Ms. Peterson offered feedback without trying to change his message, a supple but important shift from their early interactions. "Your grandfather's wisdom shines through," she noted after reading his draft. "I'm looking forward to hearing the audience's response." The night of the showcase arrived with all the nervous energy of important occasions. The school auditorium filled with families, teachers, and community members. Alex peeked from behind the curtain, spotting his mother in the third row with Mr. Rivera beside her. His friends had come early to claim a full row of seats, making supportive faces when they caught his eye. As the program began, Alex's stomach tightened with anticipation. Several students presented their work, research papers, creative stories, and poetry, each receiving warm applause. Finally, Principal Thompson approached the microphone. "Our featured presentation tonight is by a student whose work demonstrates both literary excellence and remarkable personal insight. But before I introduce him, Ms. Peterson has asked to say a few words." Alex hadn't expected this. Ms. Peterson walked to the center of the stage, looking different somehow, more open, less rigid than she had seemed at the beginning of the year. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "Teaching literature has been my life's work for over 20 years. I've always believed in its power to enlighten and transform. But this year, I learned that teaching is not just about imparting knowledge, it's also about being willing to learn." She paused, looking out at the audience with genuine emotion. I made mistakes this year, serious ones. I failed to recognize the value of different perspectives and experiences. I allowed my own limited viewpoint to affect how I treated certain students, and in doing so, I nearly silenced one of the most important voices in my classroom. A hush fell over the auditorium. This level of public honesty from a teacher was rare. Thankfully, that voice refused to be silenced, she continued. And because of that courage, not only did other students benefit, but I found myself on an unexpected journey of growth and change. She turned slightly toward the wings where Alex waited. It's my honor to introduce our featured presenter, a young man whose writing has taught me as much as I hope I've taught him. Please welcome Alex Chen. As Alex walked onto the stage, the applause felt different from the polite recognition given to previous presenters. It was warmer, more enthusiastic. He could see his mother wiping away tears, his friends grinning widely, and Ms. Peterson stepping back with unmistakable respect in her eyes. Standing at the microphone, Alex took a steadying breath. The piece I'm sharing tonight is called Bridges Between Worlds. It began as a poem about my grandfather's life, but has grown into a reflection on how we connect across differences and the courage it takes to understand each other. His voice grew stronger with each line as he spoke of his grandfather's experiences, his own challenges at Westridge, and the difficult but necessary work of building understanding. He described how change rarely happens all at once, but rather in small steps of listening and growth. My grandfather always told me that the most powerful bridges are built by those willing to stand on both shores, he concluded. When we have the courage to see through others' eyes, even briefly, we create connections that can transform not just a classroom, but perhaps a community. As the final words hung in the air, there was a moment of complete silence. Then from the back of the auditorium, someone stood. Then another person and another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, applause thundering through the room. Alex blinked back tears as he saw his mother standing proud, Mr. Rivera beaming, his friends cheering wildly. And there, at the side of the stage, was Ms. Peterson, applauding with genuine emotion on her face. Principal Thompson returned to the microphone after the applause finally subsided. In light of the important conversations that have happened in our school this year, I'm pleased to announce a new initiative at Westridge High. Beginning next semester, we're establishing an annual Diversity in Literature Award to recognize writing that builds bridges of understanding between different experiences and perspectives. He smiled at Alex. And I can think of no better way to launch this award than to name Alex Chen as its first recipient. The audience erupted in applause again as Alex accepted a certificate and small trophy, feeling both proud and humbled. Later, as people mingled in the lobby, Alex found himself surrounded by well-wishers. His grandfather had been right. Speaking truth, even when difficult, could create ripples of change far beyond what you might imagine. As the evening wound down, Ms. Peterson approached Alex and his mother. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping me become a better teacher and a better person." Alex nodded, appreciating the sincerity in her words. "Thank you for being willing to change." Walking home under the spring stars, Lin Chen put her arm around her son's shoulders. "You know what I'm most proud of?" she asked. "The award?" Alex guessed. She shook her head. "That you stood your ground with dignity. You didn't just fight against something, you helped create something better." Alex thought about that as they walked. The journey hadn't been easy, and there would surely be other challenges ahead. But tonight had shown him something important, that courage, persistence, and truth could indeed turn moments of cruelty into standing ovations. Not because the world was perfect, but because people, however flawed, held the capacity to grow and change. And sometimes all it took was one voice willing to bridge the gap between worlds.